Give someone a week to finish a task that should take 2 hours, and somehow it takes the whole week. That's not a coincidence. It's not laziness either. It's a documented pattern with a name, Parkinson's law, and once you see it, you'll notice it running underneath almost every deadline you've ever been handed. The historian Cyril Northcote Parkinson first wrote about this in 1955, while studying the British civil service. His observation was blunt. Work expands to fill the time available for its completion. Give a task a deadline of 1 day, and people find a way to finish it in 1 day. Give the exact same task a month, and somehow it takes a month too, filled with extra meetings that didn't need to happen, extra rounds of polish nobody asked for, extra second-guessing that added nothing. Parkinson wasn't writing a motivational quote. He was describing something he'd watched happen inside actual government offices, where staff numbers kept climbing year after year, even though the underlying workload stayed completely flat. That detail is the part most people skip over when they repeat this law casually, and is actually the more interesting half of it. Let's slow down on the mechanism, because work expands to fill time sounds almost mystical until you break down what's actually happening. Time itself doesn't do anything. What expands is your standard for what counts as finished. Give yourself 2 hours for a task, and done means something like solves the problem, communicates clearly, ships. Give yourself a week for the identical task, and done quietly redefines itself. Now it needs a second draft. Now it needs a stakeholder review nobody actually required. Now it needs to sit for a day so you can look at it with fresh eyes. None of these additions are frivolous in isolation. That's what makes the trap so effective. Each one feels like diligence. Stacked together, they're just time filling the container you gave it. There's a second force running alongside that one, and Parkinson named it explicitly. Officials multiply subordinates, not rivals. Meaning a manager who feels overloaded tends to solve that feeling by hiring 2 people who report to them, not by bringing in one peer who might outshine them or take their job. And here's the twist that makes the whole system self-perpetuating. Those 2 new hires, once installed, immediately need real work to justify their existence. So they generate memos, reviews, and approval steps for each other. A department can genuinely double in size while producing the same output it always did, purely because officials make work for each other, not because the mission grew. Parkinson's own famous example was the British Admiralty, where the number of ships in the Royal Navy fell sharply after World War I, while the number of dockyard officials and administrators kept climbing for years afterward. Fewer ships to manage, more people managing them. That's the bureaucratic version. Most people watching this don't run a naval dockyard, so let's bring it down to the scale of an ordinary team. Imagine a marketing coordinator who's told a client deck is due in 2 weeks. The actual content, the research, the slides, the numbers could genuinely be assembled in a day and a half of focused work. But 2 weeks is what's on the calendar, so the coordinator paces themselves accordingly. They open the deck on day 1, jot a few bullet points, and close it. They come back on day 4, reorganize the same 3 slides. By day 9, they've added a color scheme nobody asked about. By day 12, they're running the numbers past 3 separate colleagues for feedback that was never going to change the core recommendation. The deck that ships on day 14 isn't meaningfully better than the one that could have shipped on day 2. It's just been marinating in variations of the same idea, dressed up as thoroughness. Now imagine the same coordinator handed that identical task with a deadline of tomorrow morning instead. Suddenly, the extra review rounds disappear. The color scheme debate disappears. What's left is the actual work. Research, slides, numbers, done. Not because the shortened deadline made them a better worker overnight, but because the container got smaller, so the work had nowhere to expand into. Here's a third version of the same pattern, this time around hiring. Imagine a manager given 6 weeks to fill an open role. There's no shortage of qualified candidates in the first 2 weeks, but nobody gets scheduled quickly, because 6 weeks feels like plenty of runway. Interviews get spread out to accommodate everyone's calendar preferences. A decision that could reasonably be made after 3 strong interviews instead waits for a 4th, a 5th, one more just to be sure. By week 5, the team is scrambling to close out a process that could have wrapped in half the time. and the eventual hire isn't obviously better than the one who could have been chosen weeks earlier. The extra weeks didn't improve the decision. They just gave hesitation somewhere to live. Here's a fourth flavor of the same law, this time on an engineering team. A team is told a new internal tool needs to launch sometime this quarter. 3 months out feels comfortable, so nobody sprints. Planning meetings stretch longer than they need to because there's no pressure forcing a quick decision. Requirements keep getting revisited, not because they were wrong, but because there's spare time available to keep discussing them. By the time real coding starts, 6 weeks are already gone, and the actual build gets compressed into the final stretch anyway, often under more pressure than if the deadline had simply been set at 6 weeks from the start. The generous timeline didn't produce a calmer, better-built tool. It just delayed the point at which real urgency kicked in, and moved that urgency to the end instead of spreading it out. This pattern connects to a few other well-documented ideas from psychology and project management, and it's worth naming them, because together they explain why Parkinson's law is so hard to outplan. The first is something project managers call student syndrome, the tendency to start applying real effort to a task only when the deadline is close enough to feel threatening, regardless of how much total time was originally available. Give a student a paper due in 6 weeks, and serious writing often doesn't start until week 5, no matter how many good intentions existed in week 1. Sound familiar? It's Parkinson's law's sibling. Instead of work expanding evenly across the available time, it collapses toward the deadline, and the extra time in the middle just evaporates into low-intensity busy work, or outright avoidance. The second is the planning fallacy, a well-documented bias identified by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. People reliably underestimate how long tasks will take, even when they've been burned by the exact same miscalculation before. It's a different failure mode from Parkinson's law. Planning fallacy is about mispredicting duration, while Parkinson's law is about the duration you're given actively shaping how much effort gets spent. But the two feed each other in painful ways. A team underestimates a project's real difficulty, gets handed a generous timeline as a buffer against that risk, and then Parkinson's law quietly consumes the buffer, so the extra time built in for safety produces no actual safety margin at all. The third connection is older, the Yerkes-Dodson law, described by psychologists Robert Yerkes and John Dodson back in 1908, which found that performance improves with mental or physiological arousal, but only up to a point. Too little pressure and performance is sluggish. Too much and it collapses. A hard, tight deadline isn't purely bad news under this model. It's a lever that can push a team from the sluggish, no urgency zone into the focused, alert zone, right up until it's pushed too far into panicked and making mistakes. Parkinson's law is really a story about what happens on the low-pressure end of that curve, where too little time pressure lets effort drift, get diffuse, and pad itself out with make-work. There's a fourth, related idea worth a quick mention, because it's often confused with the main law, even though it's a different observation, also from Parkinson himself, what's sometimes called the law of triviality, or bike shedding. Parkinson noticed that committees will spend far more time debating a small, easy-to-picture decision, like the color of a bike shed, than they spend on a much larger, genuinely important decision, like approving an entire nuclear plant, simply because everyone feels qualified to have an opinion on paint color and almost nobody feels qualified to challenge the complex parts. It's not the same mechanism as work expanding to fill time, but it often shows up inside the same meetings, and it compounds the problem. Extra time doesn't just get filled, it gets filled disproportionately with the easiest, least important parts of the decision. There's one more piece of the puzzle worth naming, and it comes from project management rather than psychology. The engineer and business consultant Eliyahu Goldratt, who developed an approach called critical chain project management, specifically to fight this exact problem. Goldratt's observation was that individual tasks inside a project usually get padded with their own private safety buffer, added by whoever's doing the estimating, on top of whatever buffer the overall project already has. Multiply that private padding across every task in a plan, and a project ends up carrying far more slack than it needs, and Parkinson's law quietly absorbs every bit of it. Goldratt's fix was to strip the padding out of individual tasks and pool it into one shared buffer at the end of the project instead, protecting the deadline as a whole rather than every single step along the way. You don't need to run a formal critical chain system to take the underlying lesson. Padding hidden inside individual steps disappears into the work, but a single, visible, shared buffer stays protected because everyone can see exactly what it's for. It's also worth asking why generous deadlines feel so appealing to managers in the first place. Because the instinct isn't irrational, it's just misapplied. Asking for a tight deadline feels like asking a lot of people. Asking for a generous one feels considerate, even protective. Nobody wants to be the manager who set an unreasonable timeline and burned out their team. But that instinct conflates two different things: the length of the deadline and the reasonableness of the workload. A tight deadline attached to a genuinely reasonable amount of work isn't unkind, it's clarifying. A generous deadline attached to the same reasonable amount of work isn't kind either. It just quietly invites the padding, the second-guessing, and the meetings that didn't need to happen. Remote and hybrid work has made this sharper, not softer. In an office, a manager walking past a desk was an informal, constant check on whether a task with a distant deadline was actually moving. Async, distributed teams lose that ambient signal almost entirely. A 3-week deadline can now go completely untouched for 2.5 weeks without anyone noticing, simply because nobody happens to ask. That makes the interim checkpoint idea even more important than it was in Parkinson's own office-bound era, not less. Put those ideas next to Parkinson's original observation, and a clearer picture forms. Deadlines aren't just administrative bookkeeping. They're one of the most direct levers a manager has over how a team actually spends its attention. And getting the length of that deadline wrong in either direction has a real, predictable cost. Too short and quality suffers or people burn out. Too long, and Parkinson's law eats the difference. But here's the part that catches most managers off guard. And it's the twist worth sitting with. The instinct when a project feels risky is almost always to ask for more time, as a cushion against things going wrong. It feels responsible. It feels safe. And it is often exactly the decision that guarantees the project takes as long as the padding you added, whether or not anything actually went wrong. "We have plenty of time" might be one of the most dangerous sentences in project planning, precisely because it removes the one force, a tight, real deadline that was keeping the team's effort concentrated instead of diffuse. So, what does a manager actually do with this, beyond just nodding along at an interesting historical observation? Start by treating deadlines as a design decision, not an afterthought bolted onto the end of a plan. Instead of asking how much time should we give this to be safe, ask what is the tightest deadline this task can realistically hit without breaking quality. That second question forces you to separate genuine complexity from the padding that complexity usually gets wrapped in. Break long timelines into shorter, real checkpoints instead of one distant due date. A 3-month project with no interim deadlines gives Parkinson's law 3 full months to work with. The same project, broken into 6 2-week checkpoints, each with an actual deliverable that gets reviewed, gives the law almost nowhere to hide. Every 2 weeks, the container resets, and Slack has to justify itself again. Watch for the specific symptom of a task not starting despite a generous deadline. If a team member hasn't touched a project that's due in 3 weeks, that's not necessarily a sign of laziness. It might just be student syndrome doing exactly what it always does. The fix isn't a lecture about time management. It's shrinking the visible deadline, even artificially, so the pressure that drives focused effort shows up sooner. Be honest with yourself about buffer time specifically. Buffers exist to absorb genuine risk, a supplier delay, a sick teammate, a technical surprise. They don't exist to be quietly spent on cosmetic polish that wasn't part of the actual requirement. If you build in a buffer, it helps to say out loud what that buffer is for, so it doesn't just get absorbed into, well, we have time, the way Parkinson's law predicts it will. Give time boxes to individual pieces of work, not just whole projects. A 1-hour cap on a task that could theoretically stretch to a full day forces the same compression Parkinson observed at the deadline level, just at a smaller scale. And it works for almost any task that doesn't have a hard external dependency. Make deadlines visible and a little public where you can. A commitment only you know about is easy to quietly renegotiate with yourself. A commitment a teammate or a client is expecting creates the same kind of pressure Parkinson's civil servants felt when a minister actually wanted the report on their desk, and resist the urge to reward exhaustive time spent as if it were the same thing as quality delivered. A report that took 2 weeks isn't automatically better than one that took 2 days. Sometimes it's just the same conclusion, arrived at more slowly, with extra layers of polish nobody will ever notice. One more habit worth building. When you review a finished piece of work, ask what specifically the extra time brought you, not just whether the deadline was hit. If a report took 10 days and you genuinely can't point to what the last 4 days of that changed, that's diagnostic information about your deadlines, not a compliment about your team's thoroughness. Over time, tracking that gap between time given and time actually needed is one of the most useful things a manager can measure, because it tells you exactly how much slack you've been handing out by default, project after project, without ever deciding to. Here's my honest read on why this matters more now than it did in 1955. Most modern knowledge work has almost no natural stopping point built into it. A factory line has a physical limit. The machine only runs so fast. A marketing deck, a strategy memo, a piece of code, a slide review, none of that has a hard physical ceiling on how long it could theoretically keep getting improved. Which means, without a deliberately imposed deadline, there's nothing external stopping the work from expanding indefinitely. Parkinson's law isn't an old curiosity about British civil servants. It's arguably a stronger force today than it was when he first described it, because so much more of what we do lacks any natural edge of its own. The practical management takeaway is this: don't treat time constraints as an unfortunate necessity you apologize for. Treat them as one of your sharpest tools. A task given too much slack will absorb that slack completely, whether or not the extra time improves the result even slightly. Tighten the timeline deliberately, attach it to real checkpoints, and reserve buffers for named risks instead of vague comfort, and the work itself tightens right along with it. More management theories like this? Follow along.